join this webinar on the 4 steps to completing your carbon footprint. I'm Oliver Crouch, head of the Strategic Development Group at the Carbon Neutral Company, and I'm joined by Caroline Ray, who leads our carbon footprinting activities. Caroline will be presenting today, and we're thrilled to have you all with us. For those that don't know, the Carbon Neutral Company has provided climate solutions to businesses for over 15 years. We're privileged to count companies including Coca-Cola, M&S, Microsoft, and hundreds of small and medium-sized enterprises amongst those who have used us to design and deliver GHG reduction programs built on internal reductions, renewable energy, and carbon offsetting. Nearly all of these programs involve some form of carbon footprint assessment, which is where Caroline's expertise lies. As part of our mission to make carbon accounting as simple and streamlined as possible, we're hosting this webinar to give you the knowledge you need to confidently prepare a corporate carbon footprint. I'm now going to hand over to Caroline to present for around 20 minutes, leaving us with some time at the end to take your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you can do so throughout the presentation via the question tab on the control panel on your screen. Just type in your question and press send, and we'll collate these at the end of the presentation. Caroline, over to you.
Thanks, Ollie. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And let's kick off this presentation where we will discuss, first of all, what a carbon footprint assessment is. And to demonstrate this, we will be using our own carbon footprint as an example. And we'll continue to discuss our own sustainability program throughout. And we'll also explain some of the language and terminology around assessments. And then we will cover the reasons and the value behind conducting a carbon footprint assessment. And this is where we show you how to extract as much value as possible from your results and really take advantage of your work. And again, we will use our own footprint to explore the value that the Carbon Neutral Company gains each year from our own results. And then we'll look at what is involved in the process. And this section is a simple stepwise description of the process, which is followed by further detail around the application of accounting and reporting standards. And then the art of data collecting and data management. We want this section to help in making the footprint process much easier and more streamlined for you, and to really motivate you to optimize your data management skills while highlighting the advantages of strong data management. And then becoming carbon neutral and carbon neutral certified, looking at the application of the carbon neutral protocol and what is involved in the certification process. And finally, taking advantage of your work by communicating your results and the valuable message that they carry. So what is a carbon footprint assessment? First of all, it's worth noting that there's more than one way to refer to a carbon footprint assessment, and the most accurate term is a greenhouse gas assessment, since it encompasses all of the Kyoto greenhouse gases. But we generally find the term carbon footprint assessment more relatable and more commonly used in business, so we'll use that term throughout this presentation. So, what is a carbon footprint assessment? Let's start with a basic overview of what is actually assessed during the process. So the subject of a carbon footprint can vary significantly. It could be an entity, such as a company, a product, like a liter of milk, or an activity, such as an event or a service, or even an individual person. And since it's the most common subject assessed by our clients, we'll focus mostly on the practicalities of a company carbon footprint assessment throughout the presentation. And in terms of time frames, footprint inventories typically cover a 12-month period based on standard guidelines to maintain global consistency and to enable annual emission comparisons. Now, when it comes to your company, where do the emissions come from? Well, emissions would generally be produced by your company's activities, such as electricity consumption or on-site fuel combustion and new vehicles, fugitive gases, transport, emissions from waste disposal, water use, and perhaps material consumption, which is often restricted to office paper. So before we we cover the outcome of a carbon footprint assessment, I think it will help to take a brief look at the unit of measure that we use in carbon accounting so that it's very clear throughout the rest of the presentation. The unit of measure is tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is represented as CO2e. And the term is used because under the Kyoto Protocol, we measure and report on not 1 but 6 greenhouse gases, which was recently updated to 7 by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And they all have varying global warming potentials over the common timescale of 100 years. And global warming potential acts as a nice relative measure of how much heat a greenhouse gas traps in the atmosphere over that period of time. So for example, carbon dioxide has a global warming potential of 1, while methane is 21. So that means that methane is 21 times more effective than carbon dioxide at trapping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Because carbon dioxide has the lowest global warming potential, we use it as the lowest common denominator, such that it acts as this currency for calculating the equivalent amount of any other greenhouse gas, and that enables us to account for all of them together using this one unit of measure. So we have a feel for what a carbon footprint encompasses, but what is the intended outcome? The process typically concludes with a result in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent for a given 12-month period. And the information can be disseminated in a variety of ways, and this pie chart is just one example. This, in fact, is the Carbon Neutral Company's carbon footprint calendar year 2013, broken down by company activity. And the results show that over the course of the 2013 calendar year, a total of 109 tons of CO2 equivalent were emitted due to our business activities during that year. And what's interesting about these results? Well, clearly, if we intend to make significant emission reductions, perhaps the first area for us to focus on would be our business travel, where we can think about setting some targets and implement some workable solutions for reducing our emissions over time. Our carbon footprint amounted to 109 tons of CO2 equivalent in 2013. It's important for us to understand what that means and to decide what we're going to do with that information. And the same goes for all of those who are measuring. In other words, what is the value of our carbon footprint? What value do you draw from your carbon footprint? Essentially, measuring your carbon footprint is no longer innovative. It's now simply practice. And in the broader context, it's important to remember that while climate change has become a key sustainable development issue, a lot of governments are taking steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through national policies that include the introduction of emissions trading programs, or carbon or energy taxes, and regulations and standards on emissions. And your company must be able to understand and manage those risks and opportunities to ensure long-term success and value in a competitive business environment, and to be prepared for future national or regional climate policies, not to mention the wide range of potential business benefits that result from an effective carbon management program. So in order to take the first step in understanding your corporate greenhouse gas risks and opportunities and embarking on a really meaningful carbon management program that really helps you to meet your business objectives, you must first measure your current situation. And if you're currently assessing your carbon footprint, but you aren't entirely sure why, I hope this provides some insight into the basis for choosing to assess. Now, to provide an example that reveals further value in the assessment process, let's look at the drive behind our particular emissions monitoring at the Carbon Neutral Company. In this slide, the orange columns in the chart illustrate the fluctuating results of the Carbon Neutral Company's carbon footprint assessment over the last 5 years. And you can clearly see that over time, we've experienced a steady reduction in our emissions across the company, which marks great progress towards our own carbon reduction targets. And the green line shows our company's annual business activity during the same period. And the fact that business has increased while emissions are decreasing demonstrates nicely that we've successfully reduced our emissions over time while growing our business. And this is really valuable information because it shows that our improved efficiencies have really been successful. And generally, it is valuable to us to measure our carbon footprint every year because, first of all, we're a carbon neutral certified company, and we assess our footprint annually in line with the Carbon Neutral Protocol, and that's to maintain the integrity of our carbon neutral certification. And we report each year to the Carbon Disclosure Project. We've set carbon reduction targets for the company, and our annual footprint allows us to track those reductions over time. And running accurate reports each year enables us to communicate our greenhouse gas assertion with confidence. And as an environment-focused organization, obviously we feel a responsibility to run a robust internal management program based on these international best practices. So moving on to the practicalities of assessing, for those who've never taken part in a footprint assessment, it can seem a little bit daunting and complicated initially, but once you understand the basics, and especially once you've undergone a full assessment, it becomes far more interesting and thought-provoking. This is a popular schematic diagram from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol that illustrates the possible operational boundaries of your company. The cloud at the top of the page illustrates the greenhouse gases that should be included in your company's carbon footprint. And there are two main types of emissions, direct emissions and indirect emissions. Direct emissions are known as Scope 1 emissions, and they're depicted by the middle green arrow. And these include sources such as company-owned vehicles and other on-site stationary fuel combustion and fugitive gases. While indirect emissions from purchased energy that is generated off-site are Scope 2 emissions, and they're depicted by the gray arrow on the left. And all of the other indirect emissions are referred to as Scope 3 emissions, which are depicted by the other green arrow. And some examples of Scope 3 emissions are employee business travel, contractor-owned vehicles, outsourced activities, or the production of materials. So essentially, there's no limit to the scope of these emission sources, so it will depend on the operational boundary that you choose to follow. According to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, all Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions must be included in your inventory at a minimum. And the protocol also recommends that all Scope 3 emissions that are significant and can be influenced by your company should also be included in your inventory. So why should your company include Scope 3 emissions in its inventory if they aren't compulsory? This is a good question, and the answer is that it provides you with a far more realistic and accurate account of the climate impact of your business. It provides increased opportunity to engage your employees. Many businesses are able to influence the emissions of their suppliers and or customers, and it's also an excellent opportunity for any business that wants to demonstrate leadership and commitment. For those about to embark on a carbon footprint assessment or those currently conducting one, here's a general overview of the process to show you what to expect. So the first step is to select the subject of the assessment, and we'll keep using a company as an example. Then select the reporting period, and this can be in line with your financial year and or sustainability reporting period, or it can be based on the calendar year, whichever works best for your reporting purposes. And if you're due to take part in mandatory carbon reporting, the legislation recommends following the financial year period where possible. The next step is to set organizational and operational boundaries. So for operational boundaries, identify the emission sources pertaining to your company and establish that emissions boundary. For organizational boundaries, identify all entities of your organization that are sources of greenhouse gas emissions and choose a consolidation approach. you'll choose to follow the operational control approach, the financial control approach, or the equity share approach to consolidate your emissions. Setting your boundaries correctly is very important, and there are a number of complexities surrounding it with regard to how it determines which emissions will fall into Scope 1 and which will fall into Scope 3. So it's also important to make a good decision for reporting purposes, because it's best to maintain a consistent approach for the years to come. And once these parameters are established, you need to start collecting your activity data. And this means quantifying the amount of activity that took place relating to each of those emission sources. And I'll touch again on this in a minute. And once all the activity data is collated, we calculate the greenhouse gas emissions. And that is the basic process, and it will all be conducted according to an international carbon accounting and reporting standard. So let's take a brief look at those. Based on international need to have a consistent and accurate methodology that enables companies to both understand and monitor their own emissions, and for disclosure and comparison, two dominant approaches to corporate greenhouse gas accounting were developed independently. So we have the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which was developed by the World Resource Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and of course ISO 14064, developed by the International Standards Organization. And both are widely used, but the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a free guideline on corporate accounting and reporting, and it is available online. There are also standards available for product assessments, such as PAC 2060, and for the verification of emission inventories, such as ISO 14064-3. The Carbon Neutral Protocol acts as a layer on top of these standards. So if your company wishes to become carbon neutral certified, the Carbon Neutral Protocol must be applied in addition to the standard, and that is to ensure best practice for carbon accounting and reporting that guarantees the integrity and quality of any carbon neutral program. To help put this process into context, think about your company and which options would apply to your assessment. And here is an example based on the carbon neutral company. The subject of our assessment is our company. We report according to the calendar year, and as we prepare to measure our 2014 footprint, we maintain the operational control approach for consolidating our emissions. And our accounting and reporting methodology is based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as well as the Carbon Neutral Protocol. And we're measuring our emissions from energy consumption, waste disposal, business travel, staff commute, and home workers, and we'll also measure our on-site fuel combustion and fugitive emissions if they become applicable. So now that you have an overview of the general process, maybe you can identify some of the emission sources on this page that would apply to your company. And once the emissions have been measured and reported, you'll be ready to use the results for their intended purpose. And if your purpose includes becoming carbon neutral certified, the assessment will not only align with the standards, such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, it will also align with the Carbon Neutral Protocol. Now, according to the general footprint process that we've just discussed, step 4 is collecting your activity data. And this is where we measure the activities that generate emissions. What you need to do is collect 12 months worth of your company's activity data. And some examples, which you can see on the slide, are the kilowatt hours reported on your office gas bills, the liters of fuel used in your company cars, or any refrigerant gas leaks, and any other fuel that is essentially combusted on site. And all of those activities result in your company's direct or Scope 1 emissions. You'll also need to collect the kilowatt hours reported on your energy bills or meter readings, and that will account for your indirect Scope 2 emissions. You'll also be required to report your company's business travel, and that's in terms of distance and travel mode, or liters of fuel used, and waste disposed of, which is usually in weight or number of skips. So we recommend reporting on other Scope 3 emissions, such as your employee commute, your water use, and your third-party transport, especially where a particular activity is really relevant to business. The table on this slide is available in our carbon measurement guide, which is available to our clients on request, and it proves very useful, especially to first-time assessors, because it outlines the common potential sources of emissions for an average corporate inventory. And it also offers guidance on the actual units of data that are required in each case for Scope 1, 2, and 3. Calculating a carbon footprint assessment is an interesting and revealing process, but when it comes to this process of collecting activity data needed for the calculations, it can be quite challenging, of course depending on your company's maintenance of its non-financial data. So as carbon footprint measurement and reporting becomes common practice among businesses, those involved are now realizing the challenge of collecting data on an annual basis. And I'm sure you have noticed that too, because a lack of access to data can make this really the most time-consuming part of the footprint process. And often data that isn't logged throughout the year can be forgotten and can't be retrieved. And in these cases, it just has to be omitted from the carbon inventory or estimated, which ends up compromising the quality of your greenhouse gas assertion. But luckily, there is a solution to this, and it ties into the idea of how footprinting is becoming common practice among businesses. To all of our clients, we recommend moving away from this idea of data collecting on an annual basis and rather focusing on really proactive data management on an ongoing basis. Here at the Carbon Neutral Company, we're certainly no exception when it comes to facing the challenge of collecting quality carbon data. And to meet this challenge, we're shifting our approach away from annual data collecting and more towards consistent data management, which of course is a work in progress as we aim to achieve best practice. And for those of you who are also interested in this particular solution, we would recommend the following. First of all, rather than trying to collect all of your data at year end, make the decision today to set up some internal data management systems that will enable your company to log data on an ongoing basis. If this is done in a really simple and effective way, it will eventually become embedded in your existing protocol. And not only will this integrated management approach work towards streamlining your footprint process, it will also provide deeper insight into your non-financial company activities. In addition, detailed data management can reveal really interesting information about your company's operations and its emissions profile. In our experience, clients who develop detailed energy data management systems are far more likely to recognize unexpected energy drains and then actively identify reduction opportunities, which have invariably led to very desirable cost savings over time. So we really encourage you to start implementing these measures in your business today. And start by identifying what data will need to be collected, where the data can be found, and who will be responsible for its collection. It's always beneficial to designate these tasks to the right people and also ensure senior mandate is in place. So how are you measuring your carbon footprint? What is the nature of your assessing process and how does it support your business needs? It's part of our job at the Carbon Neutral Company to scour the marketplace each year and provide our clients with the best and most suitable assessment solutions for their business needs. And assessment options range from large-scale detailed software packages that automate corporate sustainability data management and reporting, through to more simplified manual solutions. And options also vary in terms of how much hands-on support and consultation is offered throughout the process. And how do we measure our footprint? Well, although we have in-house expertise, we choose to make use of a professional external assessment service because it eliminates any conflict of interest with regard to our offsetting, and it simplifies and streamlines our assessment process. The process of data collection and emissions calculation can be complex, and quality reporting is really important to really maintaining integrity, which is why a lot of companies choose to outsource the task, and companies who choose to assess in-house tend to have their calculations verified by a third party. Maintaining that integrity and removing potential conflicts of interest will enable you to communicate your carbon management message confidently and measure your progress accurately year on year. Let's take a step back from practicalities of assessing. Imagine that you have just completed your company's carbon footprint for the 2013 calendar year. Now, what does your company intend to do thereafter as part of your broader carbon management strategy? Once the measurement is complete, you have set a baseline, your company can begin to consider a strategy regarding carbon reductions. And the approach to carbon reduction can take the form of internal reductions by improving efficiencies, or external reductions through carbon offsets. If your company has set a reduction target and goal date, then analyze your results carefully and identify key areas that present promising reduction opportunities, and assess viability based on return on investment and timescales. If your company has set a net zero emission target, you can become carbon neutral by purchasing offsets equivalent to your carbon footprint, and become carbon neutral certified by conducting a carbon footprint assessment in line with the carbon neutral protocol. And all of our independent qualified third-party assessors conduct and verify greenhouse gas assessments according to the carbon neutral protocol. Now that you have set carbon reduction targets and implemented measures to achieve them, what else do you intend to do with your results? We recommend that you take full advantage of your carbon information. So take the opportunity to engage your stakeholders on your environmental action as part of promoting your carbon management program, ensuring your program delivers value to the business. So identify the right messages to turn your results into compelling content that will drive internal management and clear, credible external communications. We would say start by consulting with stakeholders based on your results. What do your staff feel about the company's current environmental standpoint? And what do your company's investors expect from future environmental performance? And following feedback from your stakeholder engagement, develop a strong environmental policy and a practical sustainability strategy. And once those are in place, develop a really intelligent and practical environmental action plan and then implement it. And this is the final step in a basic carbon management program, and it has significant potential value for any business. And follow this by measuring your carbon footprint again next year, and aim for consistent annual measurement. And soon your business will have a series of annual carbon footprint emission profiles, and that is an excellent opportunity to draw really valuable information from the comparative emission fluctuations year on year. And this will continuously inform your environmental policy, your carbon management strategy, and it will influence your overall environmental message. So we're coming to the end of the presentation now, but before we wrap up, I want to touch on a very inspiring example of a company who has first of all, demonstrated sustainability leadership and maximized the benefit of broadcasting that leadership message to their stakeholders. Commercial Group believe that their success is due to their leadership in responsible environmental practices and their willingness to talk about it, as well as their insistence on quality and credibility, including the credible and meaningful carbon footprint assessments that they've conducted throughout their sustainability journey. The company is wonderfully transparent about their journey, which they communicate in their own reporting, as well as the Carbon Disclosure Project and the Prince's Mayday Network. And because of their commitment to following a responsible environmental journey, the company has actually saved significantly because of increased efficiencies, which are a result of carbon reduction initiatives, such as intelligent electricity purchasing and light bulb replacements, as well as reduced fleet emissions through their dynamic routing system and sustainable biofuel. So at this stage, the company's sustainability journey has not only been carbon neutral, but also cost neutral, and that is certainly an inspirational message and one that the company continues to convey to its stakeholders. So this brings us to the end of the presentation. I hope it's been informative and that we've encouraged some really positive and proactive engagement in carbon accounting within your business.
Caroline, thank you very much. That's prompted a number of questions from the audience. We've probably got time for two of those. The first one is related to collecting electricity data. Someone's saying that they're struggling to collect electricity data on one of their offices. What would we recommend?
All right. So if you aren't able to access the data, you don't want it to delay your assessment process. So one option is to extrapolate using last year's data based on this year's full-time equivalent employee number, perhaps. And if that solution is not an option, maybe you didn't conduct a footprint last year or that office wasn't open last year, perhaps use another office of a similar size with similar operations and use the activity data from that office to apply a best estimate to the office that you're struggling to access data for.
Thank you very much. And then the last question, someone's asking, is there a risk of double counting of Scope 3 emissions? So for example, British Airways might report their footprint, but then also the customers that have flown on British Airways might report that as a Scope 3 emission. So I'll pick up this one. And the answer to that question is yes, there's kind of double counting, but there's double counting by design. So the GHG protocol that develops the corporate standard that we all follow for corporate carbon footprinting set up this approach of scopes, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And all Scope 3s are really another organization's Scope 1. And the same is true for electricity, for example. So the Scope 2 emissions that you report as a business, they're the Scope 1 emissions of a power generator, like EDF, for example. And the reason the GHG protocol have done that is because they want businesses to take reporting responsibility for the things that they can, they have control over and they have the ability to influence. So yes, double counting does exist between the scopes, but it's by design. And that's all we've got time for. So I just wanted to thank you all again for attending and for those questions. A recording of this webinar will be available on our website. We'd very much welcome your feedback and we'd be happy to answer any questions. There are some contact details up on the slide. But for now, we're closing the webinar. And again, thanks for attending.